He was the kind of man who could walk into any room and make the air itself feel smaller. A real estate mogul whose name was whispered like a warning in Seattle's Harbor District. People said he could ruin you before you even knew you'd crossed him. And yet, on an ordinary Monday morning, it wasn't a rival developer or a city official who stood up to him. It was a waitress on her very first day. She didn't shout, she didn't beg, she simply looked him in the eye. And everything in that cafe changed. By the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself, would you have had the courage to do what she did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, hit like, share, and subscribe. It keeps these voices alive. The bell above the door chimed. And Richard Kane stepped inside Harbor Brew like he owned the place. The chatter dipped. Cups clinked softer. He wore a tailored navy suit and a watch worth more than most people's cars. His polished shoes clicking against the tile. Martha Hill was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, when Richard's eyes locked on her. Without a word, he reached for the sugar jar, tipped it slowly until the white grains spilled in a soft cascade to the floor. Then, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said, "Pick that up with your mouth." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Martha froze, rag in hand, her cheeks flushing crimson. The cafe's warmth seemed to drain away. Richard's voice filled the silence, low and deliberate. "What's the matter, Martha? You forget how to follow instructions." She bent down, knees stiff, trying to scoop the sugar with trembling fingers. A shard from the ceramic jar nicked her palm, and a bead of blood welled up, bright against the pale crystals. Richard's laugh was sharp, the kind you feel in your spine. Clumsy and slow. "No wonder you're stuck here." At a corner table, Emily Carter set down her tray, her pulse thudding in her ears. This was her first shift, but every fiber in her body told her this wasn't just another customer having a bad morning. Around her, other patrons looked away, some staring into their coffee as if it might swallow them whole. A child at the window whimpered, tugging on her mother's sleeve. And still, Martha stayed on the floor, picking up grain after grain, while Richard stood over her, tapping his polished shoe against the tile in mock impatience. Emily's chair scraped softly against the floor as she stood. The sound somehow louder than the hum of the espresso machine or the rain pattering outside. She walked toward them, each step steady, her tray hanging loosely at her side. Richard barely glanced at her until she spoke, her voice clear enough to carry to the farthest corner. "You dropped it, not her." The words seemed to slice the air. Martha's hands stilled mid-motion, her eyes lifting in disbelief. Richard turned his head slowly, a faint smile curling, though his eyes had hardened to steel. "Excuse me," he said, as if he were mishearing on purpose. "You made the mess," Emily repeated, softer this time, but with no tremor. She didn't. Around them, a couple froze with coffee cups halfway to their lips. Richard leaned forward, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne and something bitter underneath. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" His voice had dropped into that dangerous, quiet register that makes people step back. Emily didn't. She stayed rooted, looking directly at him. "Do you?" For a moment, Richard simply stared. A vein pulsed at his temple. "I could make one call, and you'd never work in this city again." She met his glare without blinking. "Go ahead." The answer landed like a slap. His jaw tightened, shoulders drawing up. "You think you could talk to me like that?" "I think," she said, glancing at Martha, still kneeling on the tile, "that no one should be spoken to the way you just spoke to her." A chair leg scraped as someone shifted uncomfortably. In the reflection of the pastry case, Emily could see a young man raising his phone, recording. Richard's gaze flicked to it, then back to her. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "Maybe," she said, "but not this one." He straightened abruptly, looming over her. "Last chance. Apologize. Now." Emily bent down, not to him, but to help Martha to her feet. "You don't need to pick up another grain," she murmured to the older woman, her hand steady beneath her arm. Richard's laugh came out sharp and ugly. "You'll regret this. Both of you." Emily turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Finish your coffee, Mr. Kane. Or don't. Either way, you're done here. For the first time." A murmur of approval moved through the room. Richard caught the shift, and his eyes burned hotter. He reached for his coat, yanking it from the back of the chair, but kept his gaze locked on hers as he spoke through clenched teeth. "It's not over." Emily didn't answer. She only watched as he strode to the door, the bell jangling sharply when it swung open, the sound cutting through the silence he left behind. The next morning, the bell over the door didn't just chime. It clanged, as if it knew trouble had arrived. Richard Kane filled the doorway, a shadow stretching long across the hardwood floor. He wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits flanked him, their shoulders broad enough to block out the light. The cafe's chatter died mid-sentence. "Where is she?" His voice boomed, drawing every eye. "Where's the little waitress who thought she could mouth off to me?" Emily emerged from the back, carrying a tray of cappuccinos. She didn't flinch. She crossed the room as if the three of them were just another order to deliver. Setting the drinks down at a nearby table, she finally turned toward him. "Good morning, Mr. Kane. Will you be having coffee today?" The calm in her tone twisted something in his face. "I'll be having you on your knees, begging for forgiveness in front of every person here. Not going to happen," she said simply, her eyes locked on his. "But I can get you that coffee." The bodyguards took a step forward, the floor groaning under their weight. Richard held up a hand, savoring the tension. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" Emily pulled a small phone from her apron pocket, the red light blinking. "Yeah, and now, so will everyone else." A few customers shifted, raising their own phones. The quiet was thick, charged. Richard's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. Then, with a quick motion, he snatched a cup from an empty table and hurled it to the floor. Ceramic exploded across the tiles. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he barked, lunging forward to grab her arm. Emily didn't jerk back. Her free hand snapped to his wrist, pressing hard on a nerve point. He gasped and let go, staggering half a step. "That's assault," she said evenly. "And this is defamation," he spat. "I could bury you." "You already tried," she replied, tucking the phone back in her apron. For a heartbeat, the entire cafe seemed to balance on the edge of something dangerous. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then I guess we'll see who falls first." And with that, he smiled, a thin, cold curve, and took a deliberate step closer. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. From inside his suit jacket, he pulled out a thick envelope and let it drop onto the nearest table. It landed with a dull slap, drawing glances from every corner of the cafe. $10,000, he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "You take this, you get on your knees right here, and you apologize. We can both walk away." Emily's gaze flicked to the envelope, then back to him. "Not for sale." A muscle jumped in his jaw. 20. "You'd better keep it," she said, her tone flat. "You're going to need it for lawyers." The smirk on his face cracked, replaced by something darker. In one sharp motion, he seized a chair and flung it sideways. It crashed into the wall with a bang that made a toddler cry out. Cups rattled on saucers. A woman at the counter gasped. That when the cafe door opened again, and Thomas Carter stepped in. The old hardwood creaked under his boots. His gray hair was neatly combed, his eyes calm but watchful. Richard barely glanced at him. Perfect timing. "You're the manager? Fire her. Right now." Thomas didn't answer. He walked forward slowly, stopping beside Emily. "And why would I do that?" "Because she's insubordinate," Richard snapped. "She assaulted me, refused my money, and humiliated me in front of all these people." Thomas's gaze shifted from Richard to the scattered shards of the thrown chair, then to the blinking red light of Emily's phone. "I see." Richard mistook the measured tone for agreement. "So, do it. Or I'll make sure this dump never serves another cup of coffee." Thomas let the silence hang for a moment, the kind that makes a room lean in. Then he said, "I think you should know something before you give me any more instructions." Richard's brows knit. "What?" "She's my daughter." The words hit like a hammer. Murmurs rippled through the room. Richard blinked once, twice, as if he'd misheard. Emily didn't look away from him, her face unreadable. Thomas's voice stayed even. "And in my place, Mr. Kane, I think you tread very carefully about what you do next." For a long beat, Richard just stared at Thomas, as if the words needed time to sink in. The murmur of customers swelled, like the tide creeping closer to shore. Somewhere in the back, the espresso machine hissed a low warning. "You're her father," he said finally, his voice rough. "That's right," Thomas replied. "And I've been listening to you for the past 2 minutes." Richard tried to recover his footing, straightening his shoulders. "Then you should be ashamed. This girl disrespected me in front of everyone." Thomas lifted a hand, the kind of gesture that didn't need to be big to command a room. "I've got a better idea. Why don't we let everyone here decide what really happened?" Emily pulled her phone from her apron pocket. The recording was still rolling. She tapped the screen, and Richard's own voice filled the cafe. Every insult, every command to Martha, every threat. Gasps and low curses drifted from the corners of the room. Richard's face flushed red. But before he could speak, Martha stepped forward, still clutching the rag she'd been using when it all began. "It's not just today," she said, her voice trembling but clear. 3 years he's been coming here. He calls me names, throws coffee back in my face if it's too hot, too cold, too anything. Lies, Richard barked, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. One by one, other employees emerged from behind the counter. Caleb, the teenage barista, told of being called useless. Dana, who worked the register, spoke of being mocked for taking night classes. Each story added weight to the air until it felt heavy enough to bend the floorboards. Thomas turned to Paul, the shift manager who had been hovering by the pastry case, pale as milk. "And you?" Paul swallowed hard. "I didn't stop it. I thought it was better to keep him happy." "You thought wrong," Thomas said, and the finality in his voice made Paul's shoulders sag. "You're done here." The words hit almost as hard as the ones he turned back on Richard. "And you're banned. Not just from this shop. From every harbor brew in the city. Your picture will hang in the back of every counter, and if you step foot in one, the police will be called." A ripple went through the crowd, some in disbelief, some in quiet satisfaction. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out first. Then, "You think you can do this to me?" Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "I just did." For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Then Richard grabbed his coat from the chair, his movements jerky now, the smooth swagger gone. He shoved the door open so hard the bell clanged wildly, and stepped into the gray Seattle morning without another word, though everyone in that cafe knew this wasn't the last they'd see of him. Rain-slicked streets blurred past the window of Richard Kane's black sedan as it cut through downtown. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the leather creaking under his fingers. The humiliation from Harbor Brew still burned in his chest, each memory of the smirks and camera phones fueling something darker. By the time he reached the parking garage under his office tower, the plan had already begun forming. Inside his penthouse suite, the city skyline sprawled beneath a low ceiling of clouds. Richard shrugged off his coat, tossed it over a leather chair, and picked up the phone. "Billings," he barked when a voice answered. "You still have friends in the health department?" A low chuckle came through the line. "Depends who's asking and how much they're paying. $5,000 if they walk in tomorrow morning and find enough violations to make the front page. 10 if they shut the place down for a week. Consider it handled," Billings said. Richard hung up and dialed again. "Matthews, I need you to put the squeeze on a few suppliers. Coffee beans, dairy, sugar. Tell them Harbor Brew's payments are late, whatever you have to. I'll cover the difference, and then some." One by one, the pieces slid into place. But the final move, his favorite, would come from an old acquaintance with a grudge. Paul, the former shift manager, picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Kane." Paul's voice was cautious. "You want to make some quick cash?" Richard asked. 15 grand for a few inconveniences. Spilled drinks, food that doesn't pass inspection, rumors loud enough for customers to hear. There was a pause, and then Paul exhaled. 15. Split it however you want. Just make sure Carter's little princess wishes she'd never stepped foot behind that counter." Paul hesitated only a second longer before saying, "I know a couple of guys who'd help." By nightfall, Richard's war chest was set, health inspectors ready to pounce, suppliers primed to choke off deliveries. a team in place to seed chaos from within. Standing at the window, he watched the city lights flicker in the wet streets below. In his mind, he could already see the Harbor Brew front door locked, a closed by order of the city sign hanging for all to see. He imagined Emily Carter walking away in shame, her father's business bleeding out with every passing day. He smiled to himself, a thin, satisfied curve. "You think you won today," he muttered to the glass, his reflection staring back. "Eyes hard as stone. But tomorrow I'll start taking it all back." The next morning, the hum of grinders and the hiss of steaming milk were drowned out by the heavy knock at Harbor Brew's front door. When Thomas opened it, a squad of health inspectors stepped in, clipboards in hand, their eyes sweeping the room like a searchlight. "We've had an anonymous tip about serious violations," the lead inspector announced, his tone flat but loaded. Emily glanced at her father. "Anonymous?" she repeated, already suspecting. They moved through the cafe like they owned it, pulling open fridge doors, peering under counters, scribbling notes on perfectly clean surfaces. One even measured the temperature of milk that had been poured seconds before. At the same time, the phone behind the counter rang, twice in 10 minutes, first from their coffee supplier, then their dairy provider. Both claimed sudden logistical issues, meant no deliveries until next week. "Not a coincidence," Emily muttered under her breath. By noon, the air felt heavier. The inspectors were still picking over every inch, and the lunch rush had slowed to a trickle. That's when the next wave hit. Paul walked in, not in uniform, flanked by two men Emily didn't recognize. They ordered coffees, sat at separate tables, and within minutes, the accidents began. One tripped, sending a latte across the floor dangerously close to a customer. Another lifted his sandwich and shouted about finding a hair in it, waving it for nearby tables to see. The murmur started. Two customers left without paying. A woman at the counter demanded a refund before the health department shuts this place down. Emily's eyes tracked Paul across the room. He was too calm, too deliberate. When he caught her staring, his smirk was confirmation enough. She walked straight to his table. "You're not very subtle, Paul." He leaned back, feigning innocence. "Just came for a coffee." "With an entourage?" Her voice stayed low, but the steel in it carried. "Tell Kane I'm impressed. Health inspectors supply cuts. Now this. Quite the investment, just to make a point." His smile faltered for the first time. The two men shifted uneasily in their seats. "I suggest you leave," Emily continued, "before every phone in here uploads exactly what you've been doing." Paul's jaw tightened. He stood without another word, signaling the others. They slipped out, the bell over the door giving a sharp, accusing jangle. By the time the inspectors finally left, the place was quieter, but not broken. Emily moved between tables, offering calm smiles and fresh cups where needed. Inside, though, she knew the storm wasn't over. Kane was playing a long game, and this was only his opening move. 2 days later, the morning rush was in full swing when the door swung open with a force that made the bell clang against the frame. Richard Kane strode in alone this time, but the absence of his usual entourage didn't make him any less dangerous. His eyes swept the room, noting the full tables, the steady hum of conversation, the fact that Harbor Brew was still standing. Emily was at the counter, sliding a latte across to a regular. She didn't look up until his shadow stretched across the register. "Morning, Mr. Kane," she said, her tone even. "Here for coffee, but just to glare at me." He stepped closer. "I'm here for answers. How is this place still open? After everything?" She tilted her head. "Everything?" He barked a laugh, but it was brittle. "Don't play dumb. The inspectors, the suppliers, the little incidents. I paid good money to make this place choke." The cafe went still. Chairs scraped softly as a few customers shifted, their eyes flicking between them. Emily leaned an elbow on the counter. "So you're saying you ordered all of that?" "Of course I did," he snapped, voice rising. "Paid off the inspectors. Paid the suppliers to walk away. Paid Paul to stir up trouble. And you're still here like nothing happened." Phones were out now, the small red lights blinking. Richard either didn't notice or didn't care. His chest was heaving, his face flushed with the thrill of confession. Thomas appeared from the back. wiping his hands on a towel. That's quite a speech, Kane. Want to repeat it for the police? Richard turned to face him, his lip curling. You think you can scare me with cops? I've bought bigger men than them. But mid-sentence, something shifted. His voice wavered. His hand went to his chest. He staggered back a step, blinking hard. Mr. Kane? Emily's voice cut through the murmurs. He tried to wave her off, but his other hand clutched the edge of a table, knuckles white. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. I can't breathe. Then his legs gave way. The thud as he hit the floor made someone gasp. Call 911. Emily was already vaulting around the counter, dropping to her knees beside him. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse that wasn't there. Her hands found the center of his chest. 1, 2, 3. She counted compressions aloud, the crowd a blur around her. Somewhere behind, Thomas barked orders. Clear space, bring the AED, but Emily's world had narrowed to the rhythm under her palms. Richard Kane, the man who'd tried to crush them, was lying powerless on their floor. And Emily Carter wasn't going to let him die. Emily's arms burned, but she didn't stop. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Again and again. Richard's face was pale, his lips tinged gray, every second stretching longer than it should. Stay with me, she muttered under her breath, locking her elbows and driving her weight down in steady rhythm. Thomas knelt opposite her, eyes darting from her hands to Richard's still chest. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Almost here, Thomas said, though his voice was tight. Emily didn't answer. Sweat slid down her temple. She focused on the sound of her own counting, on the faint hope of a flutter beneath her palms. Then there, a faint hitch in his chest. She paused just long enough to feel the weak, ragged inhale before leaning back, her own breath trembling. Richard's eyes flickered open, glassy and confused. You? He rasped. You had a cardiac arrest, Emily told him, keeping her voice steady. You're going to hospital. Paramedics burst through the door, their gear already in hand. One took over compressions while the other began checking vitals, sliding an oxygen mask over Richard's face. She saved your life, the older medic said without looking up. Richard's gaze found her again, something unreadable passing over his expression. Why? Because it was the right thing to do, she replied simply. Within minutes, they had him on a stretcher, wheeling him toward the door. The bell chimed softly as they left, the crowd parting in silence. Emily stood there, hands still trembling, watching the ambulance pull away into the drizzle. Thomas put a hand on her shoulder. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, she cut in. Some things aren't about him. They're about who we choose to be. Outside, the wail of the siren faded into the gray morning, leaving only the murmur of customers and the low hum of the espresso machine starting up again. But the image of Richard Kane, pale and shaken, being carried away was one Emily knew neither of them would forget. A week later, the rain had given way to a rare stretch of clear Seattle skies. The afternoon light poured through Harbor Brew's windows when the bell above the door gave a soft ring. Conversations dipped as Richard Kane stepped inside, not in a tailored suit, but in plain slacks and a simple sweater. No entourage, no swagger. Just him, carrying a large envelope. Emily was wiping down a table near the back. She straightened, wary, but didn't move toward him. Thomas appeared from the office, his expression unreadable. I owe you both something, Richard began, his voice lower than anyone had ever heard it. He walked to a table and set the envelope down. Inside were signed papers, formal withdrawals of every lawsuit he'd filed, a written confession of the sabotage, and checks made out to each employee he'd harmed. I can't erase what I did, he said, meeting Emily's eyes, but I can take responsibility for it. Thomas glanced at the papers, then back at him. And after that, Richard drew a breath. I sold my penthouse, my cars, most of my company's shares. I started a foundation, Second Chance, for people in the service industry who've been bullied or abused by those with power. And I want Emily to run it. Emily blinked. You want me to? You've got what I never did, he said. Character. I can write checks, but I can't lead it the way you could. She didn't answer right away, just studied him. There was no glint of performance in his eyes, no mask. Only exhaustion and something that looked a lot like sincerity. "I'll think about it," she said finally. He nodded, almost relieved, and then added, "Until then, I like to work here. Start at the bottom. Learn what I never bothered to understand." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You clean bathrooms, wash dishes, haul boxes?" "Yes," Richard said simply. The room was quiet for a moment, then Thomas extended a hand. "We'll see if you mean it." Weeks later, Richard Kane could be found behind the counter at Harbor Brew. Sleeves rolled, apron dusted with flour, learning the names of regulars. And though the city still remembered the man he'd been, those who came through that door now saw something else. A man trying, every day, to be better than he was yesterday. Because sometimes the real victory isn't in winning the fight. It's in choosing what to do after you've lost. So if you've ever witnessed someone being treated as less, remember, your voice might be the one that turns it around. And if stories like this remind you what's worth standing up for, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. Your support keeps these voices alive.